My name is Amira Davis, 33 years old. The sting of his hand burned across my cheek, hot and humiliating. The sharp crack of skin on skin ricocheted through the cavernous banquet hall, louder than the brass band that had been playing just moments before. Gasps rippled in waves, swelling against the marble walls, until the only sound left was the echo of his voice. "You're not welcome here." My father's words thundered through the air, heavy, commanding, the same voice that once led soldiers into battle. But tonight it was turned on me, his daughter. I stood frozen, breath locked inside my chest. I could feel hundreds of eyes drilling into me, curiosity, shock, judgment. The chandeliers above swayed faintly, their crystals shimmering like fractured stars. The burn on my cheek wasn't just pain, it was memory. It was 15 years collapsing into this single moment. I had imagined this night differently. I had pictured the weight of silence breaking with honor, maybe even acknowledgement. But instead, here I was, slapped once again, reduced to nothing in front of the world. My jaw tightened, but I refused to bow. Not again. And then an unmistakable sound shattered the suffocating quiet. Chairs scraping, boots striking in perfect rhythm. One row, then another, then all at once. 400 Navy SEALs rose to their feet, 2 generals with them, their uniforms crisp, their medals catching the golden light of the chandeliers. They stood like a wall of steel, a human fortress behind me. The hall trembled with their unity. Every guest turned, eyes wide. My mother's hand fluttered to her mouth, trembling. My brother's smirk vanished into something sharp, almost fearful. And my father, his face drained of color, his hand still suspended in midair, quivered violently. Admiral Davis. That name did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to me. I hadn't flinched when his hand struck. I wouldn't flinch now. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the soldiers I had bled with, trained with, commanded through fire and shadows. Their eyes burned, not with pity, but with fury, not with doubt, but with loyalty. Then their voices boomed as one. "Admiral Davis awaiting orders!" The force of it shook the very glass of the chandeliers. Gasps turned into shocked silence. Even the band froze, their horns half raised, paralyzed mid-note. The sound was more than a salute, it was a declaration. My father's lips parted, but no sound escaped. For the first time in my life, I saw his hand, the same hand that had struck me down years ago, the same hand that tonight sought to erase me again, tremble uncontrollably. I could see it in his eyes, fear. The fear of a man who once believed he was untouchable, now realizing the truth he had tried so hard to bury, was standing in front of him, unbroken, undeniable. But this moment, this reckoning, it hadn't started here. No, the fire that forged me was lit long ago. I felt the weight of the hall pressing in on me, hundreds of eyes waiting for me to speak, for me to strike back, for me to finally deliver the vengeance I had every right to claim. But I stayed silent. My silence was command, and they waited because I willed it. My father's voice still rang in my ears, those words he spat so many years ago, the night he shattered whatever bond we had left. "You're no daughter of mine." That was the night everything changed. That was the night his hand first struck me. That was the night I stopped being his child and became something else. The banquet hall blurred at the edges of my vision, voices and faces melting into shadows. The burn on my cheek was no longer from his slap tonight, but from another, years earlier. The memory surged back, as vivid as the air I breathed. I was 18. The summer air was thick, heavy with expectation and sweat. My brother had just been accepted into West Point, and my father's chest had swelled with pride like he had earned the honor himself. Meanwhile, I had stood in the corner, invisible, daring to want something different, daring to dream of a path that wasn't his. I can still see it, the red flush creeping up his neck, the fury in his eyes when I said, "Dad, I'm not you. I'll find my own way." The crack of his palm across my face came faster than my breath, and then came the words that scarred deeper than any strike. "Get out. You're no daughter of mine." 15 years had passed since that night. 15 years of silence, of exile, of rage hardened into resolve. And yet, as I stood in this hall with 400 SEALs behind me, the memory of that first slap burned hotter than ever. The banquet guests were still frozen, waiting, holding their breath, as though the next moment would decide everything. And maybe it would. I kept my chin high, my eyes steady on the man who had cast me out. The hall trembled with the weight of what had just happened, but inside me, the storm was older, deeper. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about the night he first decided I wasn't his daughter. This was about the vow I made, walking away with nothing but a duffel bag. This was about the years of silence that built me into steel. The words of my seals still roared in the air, unyielding. "Admiral Davis awaiting orders." The room seemed to spin, and in that dizzying silence, my mind dragged me back. Back to the night of exile, back to the first time he tried to erase me. And for the first time in years, I let myself remember everything. I was 18 when my father destroyed the last thread that bound us. The summer air that night was suffocating, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. Cicadas screamed in the distance, their shrill cries echoing through the open windows of our house. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker still. My father's pride radiated from him like heat, filling every corner of the living room. My brother Nathaniel had just been accepted into West Point. My father's chest swelled as though he had personally secured the appointment, his medals gleaming faintly from the display case behind him. His hand rested proudly on Nathaniel's shoulder, squeezing it with the weight of approval. I lingered near the doorway, invisible as always, but my silence couldn't contain me any longer. My dreams were nothing like theirs, and tonight I dared to speak them aloud. "I don't want West Point. I don't want law school or the path you etched out for me," I said, voice steady, though my heart thundered. "I want to serve in my own way, to find something that belongs to me." The words felt like sparks escaping my chest, sparks that could either ignite or be stamped out. My father's eyes snapped to mine. Red crept up his neck, and his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. "You don't get to choose," he barked, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "You think you're special? You're nothing without this family, without me." I caught my mother's eyes for a fleeting second. She sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Not a word, not even a flicker of defiance on my behalf. She'd learned long ago that silence was the only shield against my father's storms. And Nathaniel, my golden brother, smirked in the corner. The glow of being the chosen one lit his face. I could see it in his eyes. Victory. Not over me, but in the validation my father poured on him. I straightened my spine. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. "Dad, I'm not you. I don't want to live your life. I'll find my own." It happened faster than I could register. The blur of his arm, the sharp crack across my face. My head whipped to the side, my cheek igniting with pain. The sting wasn't just physical. It was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. "Get out," he hissed. His eyes were wild, his voice iron. "You're no daughter of mine." For a second, the world tilted. I thought maybe he was bluffing, that his rage was blinding him. But then he stormed past me, his boots heavy against the floorboards, and yanked open my dresser drawers. Clothes flew through the air, landing in a heap on my bed. He grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, stuffing my life into it with brutal efficiency. Socks, shirts, notebooks, all thrown in like trash. I lunged forward, tears streaking my face. "Dad, please, please stop. I didn't mean—" But his hands didn't falter. His voice was colder than steel. "You will not shame me. You will not drag my name into the dirt. You leave tonight, and you don't come back." I glanced at my mother again. Her knuckles whitened around the hem of her skirt, her lips trembling. But still, no words, not one. Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a half smile curling his lips. "Guess there's only room for one Davis child worth keeping," he murmured. My father didn't rebuke him. He never did. Something inside me cracked. I stuffed my own shoes into the duffel, wiping my face with the back of my sleeve. My body shook, but I forced my legs to move, forced myself to walk past Nathaniel's smug grin, past my mother's silent grief, past my father's fury that seemed to cling to the walls. When I stepped outside, the night air wrapped around me, sticky and heavy. The porch light buzzed above, its glow faint and mocking. I paused at the end of the driveway. Behind me, the house loomed like a fortress I could never return to. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, but inside that warmth was nothing for me. Only rejection, only erasure. My father's voice followed me into the dark, not aloud, but etched into my mind. "You're no daughter of mine." I walked, one step, then another. The duffel strap bit into my shoulder, my legs stiff like they were made of lead. But my chest burned hotter with each stride, not with sorrow, not entirely. Something else had taken root. Rage. Rage at being abandoned. Rage at being discarded like I was nothing. rage that even my mother couldn't summon a whisper in my defense. I swore then, under the heavy night sky, that I would prove him wrong. Not for him, not even for the Davis name he worshipped, but for me, for the girl he tried to erase. By the time I reached the edge of town, the glow of our house had faded into darkness. My body ached, my throat raw from swallowing sobs. I found a run-down apartment to rent by the week. The wallpaper peeled, the pipes rattled when I turned the faucet. My mattress was thin, and the room smelled faintly of mold. That night, I lay on my back, staring at the cracked ceiling, clutching the duffel to my chest. My cheeks were still wet, my skin still burned, and my heart felt hollow. And yet in that emptiness something stirred. A seed. The seed of the woman who would one day walk back into his life, not as a failure, not as a burden, but as Admiral Davis. 15 years of silence stretched before me. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating silence of being forgotten, erased. But inside that silence, I would forge something he could never break. I cried myself to sleep that night, the first of many, alone, abandoned, rejected, but not defeated. When dawn broke through the cracked blinds of that dingy apartment, it carried no promises, only a dull reminder that I had nowhere to go. My face was still sore from the strike, my pillow damp from tears I would never admit to anyone. Yet even in that haze, I knew one truth. I could not stay broken. If I did, my father's words would become prophecy. So I enlisted. The recruiting officer looked at me like I was a stray cat that had wandered in from the rain, slender, pale, no connections, no family cheering me on from behind. He smirked when I said I wanted to serve. "Most don't last a month," he muttered as he handed me the papers. That smirk followed me into basic training. The first morning, the whistle's shriek ripped me from sleep before dawn. My heart hammered as I scrambled into uniform, the air raw with sweat and nerves. Around me were men and women tougher, broader, stronger. Their eyes swept over me like I was already a ghost. "She'll quit," I heard one whisper. "She's soft, doesn't belong here." They weren't wrong, not entirely. My body shook under the weight of the rucksack during drills. My lungs screamed when I ran mile after mile in boots that shredded my heels. My arms trembled so violently during push-ups that sometimes I collapsed face first into the dirt. But when my body broke, something deeper inside me refused to. Every time I fell, my father's voice rang in my skull like a war drum. "You're nothing. You're no daughter of mine." And I would grit my teeth, spit the dirt from my mouth, and rise again. There were nights I crawled back to my bunk so battered I could hardly undress. My muscles felt like torn fabric, my skin mottled with bruises. I buried my face in the thin pillow and whispered into the dark, "Pain is temporary. Failure is permanent." It became my mantra, my shield. Some recruits quit. They packed their bags quietly, their absence noted only by empty bunks the next morning. Others broke down, sobbing in showers or lashing out in drills. But me, I carried every insult like kindling, stacking it inside my chest, setting it aflame. I wasn't the fastest, I wasn't the strongest, but I was relentless. One day during rifle drills, my arms gave out and the weapon clattered to the ground. The instructor, a man carved from granite, leaned over me. His voice was sharp enough to cut bone. "You think the enemy's going to wait while you whine, Davis?" I clenched my jaw, grabbed the rifle with shaking hands, and forced myself back into position. Sweat burned my eyes, but I didn't blink. His gaze lingered. Something shifted. For the first time, he didn't sneer. He muttered under his breath, barely audible, "Maybe she'll last after all." That scrap of acknowledgement was worth more than oxygen. The weeks turned into months, each one a crucible that melted away the fragile girl I had been. The nights blurred with exhaustion, the days with punishment and drills. But slowly I learned. I learned to silence the tremor in my limbs, to swallow the ache in my lungs, to endure the weight until it became a part of me. There were moments I thought I'd break. Once, during a night march, with 40 pounds of gear cutting into my shoulders, I stumbled, knees slamming into the gravel. The recruits around me surged forward, leaving me in the dust. My vision swam, the world tilting, my body screaming to stop. Then I saw it, Nathaniel's smirk in my mind, his victory when I was cast out. My father's sneer, his voice, "You're no daughter of mine." The rage surged like a second heartbeat. I pushed myself up, one knee, then the other. Every step after that was fire, but I made it. I finished the march. No one cheered, no one helped me to my feet, but I didn't need them to. What mattered was that I had proved myself wrong. In training, I began to notice glances shift. At first, they were doubtful, dismissive, then cautious, then, slowly, grudging respect. During one obstacle course, a rope snapped beneath a recruit ahead of me. He fell hard, twisting his ankle. Panic lit his face. He wouldn't finish, and that meant failure. Without thinking, I slung his arm over my shoulder and half-dragged him through the last quarter mile, his weight nearly crushing me. We crossed the line together, collapsing in the mud. The others stared. No one said a word, but I saw something new in their eyes that day. By the time basic training ended, I was still slender, still scarred, still an unlikely soldier. But I was unbroken. The instructors didn't smile, not really, but one of them pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand after graduation. 3 words scribbled in block letters. You endured well. I carried that note for years. It wasn't glory, it wasn't love, it wasn't the validation I once craved from my father, but it was a beginning. When the bus carried us away from the training grounds, I pressed my forehead against the glass. My reflection stared back at me, eyes sharper than before, jaw set like stone. The silence inside me wasn't suffocating anymore. It was fuel. I wasn't just surviving. I was becoming. And though I couldn't see it yet, this was only the beginning of a fire that would forge Admiral Davis. War has a way of stripping away illusions. It doesn't care about your family name, your past, or the wounds you carry beneath your skin. The battlefield doesn't ask if you were once a daughter disowned. It only asks if you can survive, if you can keep those beside you alive. By the time I was 21, I found myself half a world away from the cracked ceilings of that first apartment. Dusty roads stretched under a relentless sun, the air thick with the metallic scent of gun oil and sweat. My uniform clung to me like a second skin, stained with dirt and sometimes worse. The silence of my family had been replaced by another kind of silence, the tense, waiting kind that fell before an ambush, or after gunfire when you didn't yet know who had lived or died. It was the silence of soldiers glancing at one another, a nod exchanged instead of words, because words felt too fragile to carry the weight of what we endured. The first time I held a brother in arms as life slipped out of him, I felt something in me break. His blood seeped through my fingers, warm and sticky, and his eyes searched mine like I had answers I didn't. I whispered lies I needed him to believe. You're gonna make it. Just hold on. But the silence that followed told me the truth. I carried him back anyway, not because I thought he'd wake, but because leaving him behind wasn't an option. Nights blurred into days, days into weeks. Sleep came in scraps, snatched between the crack of gunfire and the endless grind of patrols. The pounding of my heart became a rhythm I lived by, louder than the explosions, louder even than my own thoughts. There were moments of terror so sharp they should have shattered me. Once, trapped behind a crumbling wall with bullets snapping past my ears, I felt the tremor of fear seize my hands. For a heartbeat, I thought of my father, of his sneer, of his hands striking me, of his voice branding me nothing. That memory burned hotter than fear. My hand steadied, my rifle rose, and I fought. War became my crucible, and I was tempered in its fire. But even in the heat of it, the ache of absence never left. Ceremonies were the hardest. When medals were pinned, when soldiers stood tall, their families gathered close. Fathers shook hands, mothers cried proud tears, siblings cheered. I stood alone, no father to clap my back, no mother to hug me, no brother to smirk with pride instead of spite. I smiled through it, saluted sharply, let the silence swallow the ache. But later, when the barracks emptied and the lights dimmed, I would sit on the edge of my bunk and stare at the medal resting heavy in my palm. My reflection warped in its shine. That was when the longing hit hardest. To be seen, to be claimed, to matter. Still, I hardened. The silence became less of a wound and more of an armor. If no one claimed me, then I would claim myself. One mission etched itself into me forever. We were deep in hostile territory, the night sky heavy with smoke. My unit was pinned down, trapped in a narrow alley as gunfire rained from rooftops. Panic flared in the younger recruits' eyes. I saw it, the flicker of despair, the readiness to give up. And something inside me snapped. Not the fragile snap of defeat, but the sharp break of resolve cutting free. "Follow me," I hissed, crawling forward, bullets carving sparks from the wall, inches from my head. My heart hammered, but I didn't falter. If I died, so be it, but I refused to let them crumble. We moved, step by step, breath by breath. Fear turned into momentum, momentum into survival. When the firefight finally ended, when the dust settled, and we realized we were alive, every eye turned to me. Not because of rank, not because of duty, but because I had led when fear had nearly swallowed them whole. That was the night I understood. Leadership wasn't medals or orders barked. Leadership was trust, forged in silence, tested in fire. After that, something shifted. Soldiers twice my size began to follow my lead, not with blind obedience, but with something fiercer, with faith. Still, the silence of my family haunted me. There were times after missions when we returned bruised and battered, when families flooded the bases to welcome their sons and daughters home. Balloons, banners, laughter, tears, and me. I stood in the corner, watching from a distance, my chest aching with an emptiness I buried beneath my smile. But I told myself this: if they will never claim me, I will become something they can never deny. Every deployment carved me deeper. Every loss seared me sharper. But every victory, every soldier brought home alive, wove itself into my spine like steel. By the time I was 25, I was no longer the broken girl with a duffel bag. I was something else entirely. I was a soldier forged in silence. And though I couldn't see it yet, every step, every battle, every scar was leading me to the moment when I would walk back into my father's world, not as his daughter, but as Admiral Davis. The road to the Navy SEALs was paved with blood, sweat, and 1,000 broken moments that could have ended me. They said the standards were impossible, that less than a fraction of those who tried would make it. That was fine. I wasn't looking for easy. I was looking for fire hot enough to burn away the last fragments of weakness. Hell Week was the crucible. 5 days, barely any sleep, endless drills designed to break us. Cold water swallowed us whole, our bodies shaking as instructors screamed, their voices tearing through the night like thunder. Men twice my size dropped out, their bodies giving up before their wills could. Some cried, some cursed, some begged for relief. I stayed. When the waves crashed over me, when my lungs burned for air, I thought of my father's words. "You're nothing. You're no daughter of mine." Each syllable turned into fuel. Every insult became oxygen. I clawed through the surf, dragged myself through sand, forced my body past limits I hadn't known existed. There was a moment, one I'll never forget, when we were ordered to lift a massive log as a team. 6 men and me. The weight crushed down on my shoulders, the log digging into bone. My knees buckled, and I saw the glances. She'll fail. She'll drag us down. I locked my jaw, screamed through the strain, and lifted. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but enough. Enough that the log rose higher. Enough that their eyes widened. Enough that no one could call me weak again. Slowly, respect replaced doubt. The instructors tried harder to break me, but each time they pushed, I refused to shatter. When they barked in my face, I stared back, steady. When they demanded more, I gave more. They tried to make me quit. Instead, they made me steal. But it wasn't just about enduring pain. Leadership is born in fire, not in comfort. And I learned that fire comes not only from your own suffering, but from carrying others through theirs. During one grueling swim, a recruit beside me faltered. The ocean pulled him under, panic twisting his limbs. I could have saved my strength, let the instructors fish him out. Instead, I dove, dragging him up, forcing his sputtering body forward until we both collapsed on the shore. The instructors didn't praise me. They didn't need to. The look in the other recruits' eyes told me everything. From then on, they followed me, not because I was the strongest, but because they knew I wouldn't let them drown. Years blurred into missions. Missions blurred into victories and losses, laughter and grief. My reputation began to spread, whispered first among units, then in reports, then in official briefings. Iron Resolve, they called me. A name born not of glory, but of refusal. Refusal to break, refusal to abandon, refusal to let silence consume me. By the time I was 30, I had risen higher than anyone believed possible. A woman in a world that still doubted, still whispered, still measured worth in ways that excluded me. But I didn't need their permission. My scars were my credentials, my silence my weapon. When the day of my promotion came, I stood in a hall far different from the one my father once cast me from. Rows of soldiers filled the seats, their uniforms immaculate, their eyes sharp. No family waited in the front row, no father to pin the star on my shoulder, no mother to cry proud tears. And yet I wasn't alone. 400 SEALs stood with me, men and women who had bled beside me, who had followed me into fire, who had carried me when I nearly collapsed, and whom I had carried in return. They were my family now, not bound by blood, but by battle. When the insignia of Admiral was placed on my uniform, the room erupted in applause. Not polite, not perfunctory, but thunderous, earned. I stood tall, chin high, my heart steady. In that moment, I realized something. I no longer needed my father's recognition. His silence had forged me. His rejection had shaped me. And the woman who stood here now owed him nothing. But destiny has a cruel way of circling back. Because years later, when I had finally accepted that silence was permanent, an invitation arrived on my desk. The Veterans Honor Banquet, a national ceremony to celebrate generations of service, where old heroes and young soldiers would gather. I scanned the list of honored names. Colonel Richard Davis, my father. 15 years of silence collapsed into that single line. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of it pressing like a stone on my chest. I could have ignored it. I could have thrown it away. But something deeper stirred. Not vengeance, not even anger. Something quieter, heavier. It was time. Time for silence to end. The invitation sat on my desk for 3 days before I touched it again. At first I thought it was a mistake, a cruel joke. My name wasn't on it, not in the way that mattered. It wasn't for me. It was for him. Colonel Richard Davis, my father. I traced the embossed letters with my fingertip, feeling their weight as if they were carved in stone. Veterans Honor Banquet, a gathering of men and women who had given their lives to service, a celebration of legacies. My chest tightened. Legacies. My father's name would echo there, but mine? Mine had been silenced for 15 years. I could have thrown it in the trash. I should have, but I didn't. Every night that week, I sat at my desk staring at it. Memories bled through. The night he cast me out, the slap that seared my cheek, the duffel bag shoved into my arms, the silence that followed. No letters, no calls, no recognition, even when my name began to surface in military briefings, even when whispers of iron resolve reached the very halls he once commanded. Still, he said nothing. So why now? Why this? On the 4th night, I poured myself a glass of water, but it might as well have been whiskey with how it burned going down. My reflection in the darkened window looked nothing like the girl who had left home at 18. The uniform hanging in my closet gleamed with medals, the stars on my shoulder heavy with years of command. And yet, as I stared at the invitation, I felt 18 again, small, exiled, forgotten. But that girl no longer existed. The morning of the banquet, I stood in front of the mirror, my dress whites pressed to perfection. The 4 stars on my collar caught the morning light, gleaming like scars forged into steel. I adjusted the fabric, smoothed the sleeves, and stared at the woman in the reflection. Would he even recognize me? Would he see anything but the daughter he threw away? I exhaled slowly, steadying my pulse. I'm not going for him, I whispered. I'm not going for revenge. I'm going because silence has lasted long enough. The hall was nothing short of grand. Marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. Flags draped from vaulted ceilings, each one heavy with history. Rows upon rows of chairs filled with veterans, dignitaries, families. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, brass, and something older, pride, perhaps, or ghosts. A brass band played softly in the background, the notes solemn, reverent. Conversations hummed like static, low and constant. My boots struck the marble with each step, their rhythm sharp and unyielding. I walked without announcement, no entourage, no fanfare, but eyes turned anyway. Some widened in recognition, others whispered, the syllables of my name scattering through the crowd like sparks. And then I saw him. Colonel Richard Davis, my father. He sat near the front among other decorated veterans. His back was ramrod straight, his silver hair clipped close, his chest heavy with medals polished to brilliance. Age had not softened him. His expression was carved from stone, his pride intact, his authority radiating. My mother sat beside him, thinner now, her eyes weary, lines carved deep into her face. She stared down at her folded hands, as if afraid to look up. Nathaniel was there too, crisp uniform hugging his frame, the smugness that had once lived in his teenage smirk now etched into his adult jawline. His gaze flicked to me, narrowed, hard. I approached slowly, each step dragging every ghost of the past with me. Whispers grew louder. Some leaned closer to their neighbors. Others sat straighter. My mother's head finally lifted. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though she'd seen a ghost. My brother's jaw clenched, the corner of his mouth twitching with disdain. And my father, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. I offered a polite nod, my expression unreadable. There was an empty seat near them, reserved for family of the honored. I stepped toward it, not to sit in his shadow, but because I had earned my place in that hall, whether he liked it or not. But before I could reach it, his chair screeched against the floor as he stood. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. And his voice, thunderous, unyielding, roared across the hall. "You're not welcome here!" It was the same voice that had commanded soldiers, the same voice that had banished me from his house. But tonight it carried something else. Panic, desperation. The air grew heavy, suffocating. My chest rose and fell, steady but burning inside. Then, before I could react, his hand lashed out. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed like a gunshot. Gasps exploded across the room. The brass band faltered, horns dropping mid-note. My cheek stung, but I stood rooted, unflinching. Not this time, not after everything. He snarled, spittle flying. "You came here to disgrace me, to humiliate me in front of everyone." The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence that trembles, waiting to explode. And then it did. The scrape of chairs, the thunder of boots. 400 Navy SEALs rose in unison, 2 generals with them, their movements crisp, mechanical, unyielding. A wall of steel formed behind me. Their eyes burned with fury. Their presence swallowed the hall. And then, as one, their voices thundered through the marble chamber, rattling chandeliers, shaking hearts. "Admiral Davis awaiting orders?" My father froze, his hand trembling in midair, his face draining of color. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. The reckoning had begun. The sound of their voices, 400 SEALs and 2 generals declaring their allegiance, did not fade. It clung to the walls of the banquet hall, vibrating in the very air, as though the marble itself trembled beneath the weight of it. "Admiral Davis awaiting orders." The guests recoiled in shock. Some pressed their hands to their chests. Others whispered frantically, their eyes darting between me and the man who had just struck me. Even the chandeliers overhead rattled faintly, their crystals catching the light like shards of glass. I stood tall, chin lifted, cheek burning. My silence carried more power than any words could. My father's hand, still half raised from the slap, now quivered violently before it fell limply to his side. His lips parted, but no words came. His authority, the same voice that had commanded battalions, that had banished me years ago, meant nothing here. He looked smaller already, dwarfed by the sheer force standing at my back. Whispers spread like wildfire. "She's his daughter." "Admiral Davis? My God, she's the one they call Iron Resolve." The hall was no longer his, it was mine. My brother shifted uneasily, his confident posture faltering for the first time. My mother's hand trembled where it covered her mouth, her eyes wide, glistening. And then came a voice from the crowd. An older woman, her hair white as snow, her frame frail, but her voice carrying, with surprising strength. "I know who she is. Afghanistan 2012. She pulled my son out under fire when no one else could. He lived because of her." Another voice rose, a man in uniform, his hand clenching the chair before him. "She commanded Black Tide. Half of us wouldn't be here if not for her." Then more voices followed, scattered at first, then swelling. Veterans, soldiers, families, all naming battles, missions, rescues. Each testimony wove a tapestry of truth my father could not tear down. The room shifted. The whispers weren't about me anymore. They were about him. How could he? His own daughter? Striking an admiral in front of them all. 2 generals stepped forward from the wall of steel behind me. Their uniforms glittered with medals, their faces carved with age and history. They stopped at my side, saluted sharply, their voices cutting the silence. "Admiral Davis," one said, crisp and unwavering. "Your orders, ma'am." The words struck my father harder than any blow I could have delivered. His knees nearly buckled. He looked wildly around the room, searching for some shred of support, some voice to echo his own, but none came. Instead, silence pressed in on him like a vice. The SEALs behind me remained at attention, their fury barely contained, their discipline unbroken. I could feel it radiating from them, a storm coiled tight. They had seen their leader struck, humiliated. Their restraint was not weakness. It was loyalty, waiting for my command. But I gave none. I simply stood, letting the silence stretch, letting it strangle him. My father stumbled back a step, his chair toppling with a crash. My mother reached for him instinctively, but he shook her off, pride still clawing desperately at the remnants of his authority. His voice cracked as he spat. "She's no admiral. She's nothing. She's a liar." The words echoed, but this time no one believed them. The room recoiled. The veterans who had spoken earlier glared openly. The general's expressions hardened, their silence more damning than any rebuke. And in the crowd, I saw something in my brother's face I had never seen before. Not disdain, not arrogance, shame. He looked away, jaw tight, unable to meet my eyes. The banquet master stood frozen at the podium, papers trembling in his hands. The brass band sat slack-jawed, instruments hanging forgotten. Every soul in the hall knew the truth now. Colonel Richard Davis was no longer the voice of authority. He was a man unraveling before their eyes. I stepped forward once, the sound of my heel on the marble like a gunshot. My father flinched, as though struck again. His eyes, once sharp, once filled with the fire of command, were glassy now, hollowed by fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The soldiers behind me, the generals at my side, the veterans in the crowd, they were my voice. Their presence, their loyalty, their respect. It was louder than any words I could ever speak. For the first time, my father saw me, not as the failure he believed I was, but as the leader he could never deny. And in that moment, he realized something devastating. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap that started it all. The banquet hall had turned into a courtroom without a judge, and every gaze was a verdict. My father stood trembling, his medals gleaming like mockery under the lights. The proud colonel, the man who once defined me as nothing, now looked small, fragile. His lips quivered as though he might speak, but words failed him. For most of my life, his voice had been law. When he barked orders, people obeyed. When he boasted, others applauded. When he branded me worthless, silence from my mother and brother confirmed it. But now, here in this hall, silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me. The SEALs behind me didn't move, yet their presence was thunder. Their discipline radiated like a storm held on a leash. 2 generals still stood at my side, their salutes crisp, their loyalty unquestioned. The audience leaned forward, waiting for me to strike back, to deliver the vengeance everyone knew I had earned. But I didn't. I let the silence drown him. He looked around, desperate, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for support. None came. My mother's hand covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Was it shame? Was it regret? I would never know. My brother looked away, his jaw tight, his pride shattered in the reflection of his own cowardice. My father clung to the back of his chair like a drowning man to driftwood. His chest rose and fell rapidly, the weight of humiliation crushing him. "No," he rasped, more to himself than anyone. "She's weak. She's always been weak." The words cracked midair, breaking like brittle glass. And then voices rose again. A veteran with a cane stood, his voice rough but steady. "Weak? She carried me out when I was bleeding in the sand. If weakness looks like that, God help the strong." Another followed, a young woman, her uniform pressed sharp. "She taught me how to lead, how to stand when everything broke. Without her, I wouldn't be here." More voices joined, each one a nail in the coffin of my father's authority. They weren't just defending me. They were declaring a truth he could never bury again. I didn't ask for applause, but it came anyway. At first, scattered claps, then rolling waves, then thunder. Veterans stood, families rose, dignitaries pressed their hands to their hearts. The hall filled with the sound of recognition, not for Colonel Richard Davis, but for the daughter he cast out. The applause shook the chandeliers, quivered the flags, rattled the very air. My father swayed, his hand gripping the chair tighter, his face pale and hollow. I turned, my heels striking marble like gunfire. The seals parted for me, their eyes burning with pride and fury both. Some faces glowed with respect, others tightened with restraint, but all stood as sentinels, immovable and unbreakable. I didn't look back, because I didn't need to. My silence had already spoken louder than any outburst ever could. As I reached the door, the applause swelled to a roar, the hall transformed into a cathedral of honor. Every clap was another piece of armor forged around me, every cheer another chain broken. Behind me, my father collapsed into his seat, drowning in the silence I left him with. That night, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to strike back. Because sometimes the greatest victory is to live in such a way that your enemies, your doubters, your betrayers cannot deny the truth of who you are. I was Admiral Davis, and the girl he had thrown away had become the woman who would forever silence him. So, if you hear my story and see a piece of yourself in it, if you've been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced by those who were supposed to love you, remember this. Your silence does not mean defeat. Sometimes it means strength. Sometimes it means patience. And when the time comes, when your truth stands undeniable, your silence will roar louder than any voice.